They think I'm an unknown old man, easy to defeat? Wrong. What do you want to do? Lay a hand on me? I'm not afraid of you, and you're not worthy to bully me." The old man coldly stared into the police officer's eyes, as if looking at a wild dog, unwavering. They have no idea that the name they're mocking will make this entire system kneel. In the scorching heat of midday summer, the oppressive heat of the season made everything seem to come to a halt. The quiet neighborhood near the upscale residential area appeared devoid of life, except for the noise of cars passing by. Here, silence sometimes seemed the most unsettling, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Joseph Taylor, an elderly black man, walked slowly along the sidewalk. His pace wasn't quick, but each step carried with it a resilience, something unpredictable. Under the blistering sun, his figure seemed even more silent against the backdrop of the tall buildings around him. His gaze was calm, as if he were walking through a world where nothing could make him fear. But what he didn't expect was that his life would be changed completely in the next few seconds. Officer Mark Rivers, the white police officer, spotted the elderly man from a distance while driving his patrol car. Although there was nothing unusual about the old man's behavior, an obscure feeling, something was off, made Rivers pay closer attention. The kind of feeling only people like him could recognize, the sense of power, suspicion, and the awareness that everything was under control. He adjusted the car, slowed down, and veered to the other side of the sidewalk. In an instant, a choice was made, a decision carried out. Officer Rivers stopped the car, his hand touching the radio, his eyes fixed on the elderly man walking calmly. "Come here, old man," the officer barked, his voice as hard as steel. "Why are you standing here? Show me your papers now." Joseph Taylor didn't respond, continuing his steady walk. Each step seemed indifferent to the officer's presence or the shouting. People around might have turned their heads, but no one dared intervene. The old man was like a ghost in the wide streets, silent yet certain. His silence only made the officer more frustrated. Officer Rivers didn't wait long. He opened the car door and stepped out. His voice rose, filled with anger. "You can't just stand here without a reason. You don't belong in this area. I need your papers now." The officer moved closer, step by step, his eyes flashing with anger and disdain. The sense of power in him seemed to surge. When he got closer to the old man, the officer lifted Joseph Taylor's shirt, inspecting him as if he were a suspected criminal. In those moments, there was no respect, only roughness and judgment. The elderly man didn't respond, simply standing still, his gaze unwavering, as if unaffected by anything around him. Under the glaring sunlight, the wrinkles on his face were like marks of time, but in that stillness, he maintained a strength that the officer couldn't see. "You have no right to treat me like this." The old man, with a steady expression, stared directly at the officer, his voice low but filled with power, enough to halt everything. "They don't know who I am," he muttered, as if whispering to himself, but it was also a strong challenge to the officer in front of him. A statement full of meaning, not just aimed at the officer, but also affirming what he possessed, a kind of power others could not comprehend. The officer stood there, unable to understand what was happening. Joseph Taylor's eyes were not those of a frail, elderly person, but of someone who had been through everything, who had witnessed the highs and lows of life. And in that moment, he didn't need to say another word. That one sentence, though softly spoken, was a clear warning. He was not someone the officer could easily suppress. Officer Rivers felt an odd sense of confusion rising within him. He didn't know why, but that feeling kept growing stronger. The challenge in the old man's gaze was something he couldn't ignore. Everything suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if the world wasn't as simple as he had thought. This wasn't just a frail old man, but someone with a quiet strength he couldn't fully grasp. Joseph Taylor wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't scared or worried about anything. He kept his gaze steady, one hand holding his phone, the other ready to dial a number, a call that would change everything. Officer Rivers stood there, his sense of power slipping away from him, and when he realized that this elderly man was not an ordinary person, but someone who could turn the tables, the officer slowly began to understand he had made a huge mistake. The old man wasn't someone who could be subdued by shouting or orders. Joseph Taylor's words, though simple, carried a strength that could not be measured, and that was when the officer understood this encounter was no coincidence. This old man, with his simple appearance, could make the whole system take notice. Officer Mark Rivers continued to grip the elderly man's arm, his gaze filled with anger and frustration. Sweat dotted his forehead, but not from the oppressive summer heat. It was from his own disappointment. He couldn't understand why the old man behaved this way, unresponsive, unafraid. The two of them stood in the silent street, yet the atmosphere couldn't have been more tense. The sense of power that the officer always prided himself on now seemed to slip away. With each passing second, he felt his control shattering like broken glass. "Get down now," the officer snapped, his anger growing, his hand tightening around the old man's wrist, pulling him toward the ground. "You have no right to be here. Get down now," he yelled, as if that order would make everything return to normal. But the old man remained still, maintaining his calm composure. His eyes didn't waver. They stared straight at the officer, as though he didn't recognize the officer's command. At that moment, Officer Mark Rivers could no longer contain his rage. He was so frustrated that he couldn't think clearly. "Who do you think you are, not following my orders?" The question lingered in the air, full of contempt and authority. Still, the old man stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the officer's face. Joseph Taylor slowly reached into his jacket pocket, a gentle movement, as if there were no rush. His fingers moved lightly, and in a brief moment, the old man pulled out his phone. The officer saw the action and immediately felt a chill run down his spine. Instead of kneeling, the old man calmly took out his phone, as if nothing particularly serious was happening. There was no panic, no resistance, only an unnerving calm. The officer still kept his grip on the old man's wrist, but now he felt his patience beginning to run thin. The old man didn't look at the phone. His gaze remained fixed on the officer. "It's not that I'm not afraid of you." His voice was soft but commanding. "I just don't want to waste my time on someone unworthy." His words hit the officer like a slap to the face, snapping him out of the illusion that he was in control. The officer couldn't say anything, unable to understand why the old man remained so unbelievably calm. It wasn't the usual challenge. It was a deeper defiance. It was a challenge to authority, a recognition that this man was not someone he could easily manipulate. Joseph Taylor began dialing a number, his actions so calm that it made the officer feel as if everything around him suddenly blurred. The officer still stood there, his hand firmly gripping the old man's wrist, but now his gaze was uncertain. The sense of power in him had dissipated, leaving only confusion and unease. The old man wasn't rushing, wasn't worried, just calmly waiting. The officer increasingly felt like the one at a disadvantage. The old man's words echoed in his head. "It's not that I'm not afraid of you." Officer Mark Rivers saw the numbers on the old man's phone screen, but he couldn't understand why it made him feel as if some danger was approaching. The officer was no longer sure he could keep the old man restrained. Although his grip remained tight, the sense of control was gone. The old man's calm demeanor made him start to doubt himself. Joseph Taylor continued dialing the number, not in a hurry, not showing any sign of fear. That feeling, the calmness in the face of a clear threat, made the officer feel like he was standing on the edge. The officer no longer saw himself as the one in control of the situation, but rather the one being controlled. That sensation spread, and a question suddenly flashed in his mind. Who am I really facing? The officer couldn't say anything, only staring at the old man's phone screen, then at his face, where there was no remorse, no fear. The old man's gaze remained steady, as if he knew he held the power in his hands, a power no one could predict. His words weren't just casual speech, but a reminder of true power, of steadfastness and unyielding determination. The old man, once seemingly anonymous, was slowly forcing the officer to face a truth he had never imagined. Officer Mark Rivers still couldn't take his eyes off the old man. He kept his hand on the man's wrist, but the harshness of the action had faded, replaced by anxiety and confusion. A call from the Supreme Court would change everything. Nothing would be the same again. Joseph Taylor slowly raised his hand, not in a hurry, showing no sign of difficulty or fear. With a gentle motion, he pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. His eyes never left the officer, his gaze sharp enough to make the air around them suddenly feel thick with tension. While the officer continued to hold the old man's arm, there was no sign of worry or tension in his movements. Instead, his calmness only seemed to confuse the officer, as though everything the old man was doing had a purpose the officer couldn't grasp. Officer Rivers, not understanding why the old man acted this way, felt uneasy. He began to doubt what was happening before him. "What are you doing?" the officer asked, his voice no longer as certain as before, laced with a hint of worry and confusion. His gaze moved from the old man's hand, where the phone was firmly gripped, to his cold expression. The old man didn't answer the officer's question, silently continuing to dial, showing no reaction other than keeping his eyes locked on the officer. The officer realized that the old man's calmness wasn't a sign of weakness or fear, but a silent power he couldn't explain. While the officer continued to grip the old man's arm, trying to control the situation, Joseph Taylor remained unhurried, occasionally glancing at the officer as though assessing him. The tension of the moment stretched on, causing Rivers to feel as though the walls around him were collapsing. The sense of power he always held was suddenly dissipating, replaced by unease. The officer tried to fill the silence with questions and accusations, but nothing seemed to have any effect. The old man continued his call, his fingers deftly moving across the phone screen as if he were doing the most ordinary thing in the world. "Justice is not something you can take away," Joseph Taylor whispered into the phone. His soft but authoritative words hit the officer's confidence like a heavy blow. The old man didn't shout or raise his voice, but his words penetrated the officer's mind, like an undeniable warning. These words weren't just aimed at the officer holding his arm, but were a warning to anyone who abused power without understanding that justice couldn't be discarded or denied. Officer Rivers stood there, feeling as though he had made a grave mistake. His heart raced, not out of fear, but because he realized he no longer had control of the situation. What was happening before him was not a confrontation between a police officer and an innocent citizen, but a clash between power and justice, between a powerful challenge and the resistance of a man unwilling to bow to injustice. The sense of helplessness gradually filled the officer, making him unable to keep holding the old man any longer. The officer stared at the phone, not understanding what was happening. At that moment, the phone was no longer just an object of the old man's. It seemed like a tool of power, as if from its screen would emerge a storm that he couldn't stop. The old man continued speaking on the phone, not in a hurry, not worried, but in every word, Rivers felt the presence of an invisible force he couldn't confront. That sensation confused him. His confidence, everything he thought he controlled, now seemed faded and meaningless. Justice is not something you can take away. The old man's words echoed in the officer's mind. Those words were not just a statement, but a warning about the power of justice, about how those who abuse power cannot go on without facing the consequences. The sense of power Rivers had once taken pride in now became an unbearable burden. He realized he wasn't facing an unknown old man, but someone who could change everything with just one phone call. The feeling of worry and confusion continued to consume Rivers. He looked at the old man with suspicion, but couldn't take his eyes off him. Meanwhile, Joseph Taylor kept talking on the phone, his hand gently moving across the screen, as if nothing was urgent. Officer Rivers realized he was being controlled by the old man's calmness, the sense of power slipping from his hands the moment the old man began dialing. The old man didn't need to say anything more. His words, "Justice is not something you can take away," were enough to melt the officer's arrogance. The old man's silence was like an undercurrent rising, silent but strong enough to shatter the fake calm the officer once had. The old man didn't need to act, didn't need to shout, because his challenge lay in his own calmness and resolve. Officer Rivers began to feel a sudden storm rising in his mind. He no longer had confidence in his power. What the old man said wasn't just a threat, but a truth he couldn't deny. The feeling of being pulled out of his self-satisfaction made him feel like he didn't deserve to stand there. In his silence and determination, the old man had forced him to confront the truth he had long ignored. The old man's words weren't just resistance. They were an awakening, a reminder of justice that the police, those with power, seemed to have forgotten. The officer still held tightly onto Joseph Taylor's arm, his grip tightening as if to ensure nothing could escape his control. However, a sense of unease gradually rose within him. Although he maintained his dominant posture, his gaze couldn't help but be drawn to the old man's calmness. The old man showed no signs of panic, no fear, simply continuing to hold the phone, as if performing an ordinary action. Officer Rivers began to sense something unusual about the situation. Despite the old man being frail and elderly, why did it feel like he was facing something he couldn't fully comprehend? The situation no longer seemed as simple as he had imagined. The old man remained silent, his eyes never leaving the officer, but his fingers continued to move across the phone screen. Every movement was gentle, unhurried, but radiated an undeniable confidence. The officer couldn't understand why the old man acted this way, showing no resistance, no fear. The tense atmosphere between them seemed like a test of power. Officer Rivers began to feel like he was losing control of the situation. Every second that passed felt like a challenge to him, and the unease from the old man only made it harder for him to break free from his thoughts. Then suddenly, a cold voice came through the phone. "I'm listening." The voice was sharp as a blade, cutting through the air. The officer jolted, his body slightly swaying, as if pushed away from himself. The voice wasn't the old man's, it was someone else's, someone with power. He couldn't guess who it was, but the certainty and coldness in the voice made him suspicious. That voice, emotionless, made the officer feel that something much larger was happening, something beyond his understanding. Justice is not something you can take away. The old man's previous words now seemed more than just a warning. Now, the officer could feel the truth gradually unfolding with every word, every breath the old man took. That strange feeling enveloped the officer once again. He looked at the old man, and in that moment, all he saw was terrifying calmness. The old man didn't need to say anything else. All he did was hold the phone, his hand steady, while his gaze remained fixed on the officer, as though evaluating every move the officer made. Officer Rivers began to realize he could no longer act as before. A sense of unease, of uncertainty, began to rise within him. He wasn't facing an anonymous person anymore. He was facing someone who could change everything with just one phone call. Now, he felt deceived. Every second that passed increased the officer's helplessness, and the sense of power he once held now seemed meaningless. The old man remained silent, but every action of his felt like a declaration of war. The officer felt trapped by his own unease. With each passing moment, he felt himself sinking deeper into a difficult situation. The sense of power was gone, his confidence now nothing but an empty shell, leaving only confusion. He began to realize he was no longer the one in control. When Joseph Taylor gently set the phone down, without a word of farewell, the officer seemed to snap out of it, as if jolted awake from everything he had thought was certain. "It's over. You will pay for this," the old man said, his voice not harsh but enough to make the officer feel like he was being pushed to the edge. Those words were not just a warning, they were a sentence, a declaration of his power in the situation. Those words weren't just words, they carried a truth the officer couldn't deny. The officer stood still gripping the old man's wrist, but his gaze had completely changed. He could no longer treat the old man with brutality. That feeling, the feeling that this old man was not someone he could easily bully, had completely changed how the officer viewed the situation. The old man's patience was not submission. It was a quiet strength the officer had never imagined. Officer Rivers now had no choice but to realize that he had been wrong about everything. "You will pay for this," Joseph Taylor repeated, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was a statement with absolute certainty. The officer couldn't do anything more. His mind was spinning with thoughts, but there was one thing he couldn't deny. He no longer had control. The old man had reclaimed the power, and now the officer was left with the heavy feeling of failure. This story wasn't about oppression. It was a story about awakening, about justice being taken and then returned. Joseph Taylor didn't need to do anything more. He had changed the course of everything with just one phone call. Joseph Taylor slowly released his grip from the officer's wrist, his movement so gentle it was almost unbelievable. His eyes no longer reflected any tension or worry, only a calmness that felt unsettling. Officer Mark Rivers was completely taken aback by this action. He couldn't believe the old man had responded this way. Normally, when dealing with an innocent person or someone being subdued, he could easily control the situation. But now, not only was he unable to control it, but he also felt as though he was being controlled by someone he had previously not given any respect. The old man only needed a glance and a gentle action to leave all three officers in a state of shock and confusion. Officer Rivers began to feel an unease rising in his chest. His hands started to shake uncontrollably, not out of fear, but because he realized that the person he thought he could easily overpower was not an ordinary man. That surprise drained him of his strength. The old man, with his silence, seemed to show him that the power he thought he had was only a fragile shell that could be easily shattered. The officer's gaze gradually became hazy, as if he could no longer comprehend the situation. With every passing second, doubt grew in his mind, but he couldn't clearly define what was happening. While still holding the old man's hand, Officer Rivers could no longer suppress the anxiety swelling within him. His grip tightened, but that grip no longer gave him the sense of power it once did. Instead, it only made him feel more uneasy. The old man stood there, offering no resistance, relaxing his body as if observing everything around him with a strange calmness. Officer Rivers felt as if he no longer had control of the situation. He didn't know what to do next. The anxiety prevented him from speaking, and he just stood there, staring at the old man with confusion and fear in his eyes. "Who are you? What are you doing?" The officer finally spoke, but his voice lacked confidence. The question rang out, but it wasn't strong enough to confront the old man. The old man just stood there, eyes locked on him, with an unwavering gaze, showing no fear. Even though the officer asked 3 times, the old man didn't immediately respond. He could feel that in the silence of the old man, something was threatening his own self-assurance. Officer Rivers suddenly realized that he was facing someone he couldn't easily control, someone who could overturn everything with just a glance or a word, someone he had thought was insignificant, but now revealed himself to be more important than anything the officer could have imagined. Officer Rivers felt as though he were trapped in an inescapable snare, a trap he had unintentionally set himself. His confidence, the power he always believed he controlled, now felt like shattered toys under the old man's sharp gaze. The old man didn't need to say much or raise a hand. His silence struck like a lethal blow to the officer's self-respect, making him feel completely powerless. The officer realized he had been wrong to underestimate this man. The feeling of failure began to creep into his mind. Everything he had once believed in now seemed like a joke. He couldn't say anything, standing there hesitantly before the old man's challenge. The old man no longer wasted time. After a silence filled with power, he gently picked up the phone and said, "They'll know right after this call." It was a soft statement, yet carried a powerful confirmation. Officer Rivers stood still, unable to speak. The old man's words were like an unbreakable command, as though he had seen everything coming before it happened. The officer's confusion grew stronger within him. He realized he was in a situation he couldn't control. Officer Rivers knew that, even if he could stop the old man now, the consequences wouldn't end, and the old man had placed the entire system in a difficult position. Joseph Taylor turned and walked away, not looking back. His movement was unhurried, showing no urgency, yet carried a clear sense of resolve. Officer Rivers and his 2 colleagues could only watch, powerless to act. Their eyes followed the old man's retreating figure, but the confusion in their minds only deepened. The old man had completely turned the tables, making those in power, who once thought they could manipulate everything, now face an undeniable truth. No further words, no additional forceful actions were needed. The old man had changed everything with just one phone call. The story they thought would end quickly now opened a new chapter, one they couldn't predict. Joseph Taylor slowly released his grip from the officer's wrist, his action so gentle it seemed almost unbelievable. His eyes no longer showed any sign of tension or worry, only an unsettling calm. Officer Mark Rivers was completely caught off guard by this action. He couldn't believe the old man had reacted this way. Normally, when facing an innocent person or someone being subdued, he could easily control the situation. But now, not only was he unable to control it, but he also felt as though he was being controlled by someone he had previously not taken seriously. The old man only needed a glance and a gentle action to leave all 3 officers in a state of surprise and confusion. Officer Rivers began to feel a rising sense of unease. His hands started to tremble uncontrollably, not out of fear, but because he realized that the person he had thought he could easily overpower was not an ordinary person. That surprise drained him of his strength. The old man, with his silence, seemed to show him that the power he thought he possessed was only a fragile shell that could easily be shattered. The officer's gaze began to blur, as if he could no longer assess the situation clearly. With every passing second, doubt grew in his mind, but he couldn't quite figure out what was happening. While still holding the old man's hand, Officer Rivers couldn't suppress the anxiety rising within him. His grip tightened, but that grip no longer gave him the feeling of power it once did. Instead, it only made him feel more uneasy. The old man stood there, offering no resistance, just relaxing his body, as if observing everything around him with a strange calmness. Officer Rivers felt he was losing control of the situation. He didn't know what to do next. The unease prevented him from saying anything, leaving him standing there, staring at the old man with confusion and fear in his eyes. "Who are you? What are you doing?" The officer finally spoke, but his voice lacked confidence. The question rang out, but it wasn't strong enough to confront the old man. The old man just stood there, looking straight at him, his gaze unwavering, showing no fear. Even though the officer asked 3 times, the old man didn't immediately respond. The officer could feel that, in the old man's silence, there was something threatening his own self-assurance. Officer Rivers suddenly realized he was facing someone he couldn't easily control. Someone who could overturn everything with just a glance or a word. Someone he had thought was insignificant, but who now showed himself to be more important than anything the officer could have imagined. Officer Rivers felt as if he were trapped in an inescapable snare, a trap he had unknowingly created himself. His confidence, the power he always believed he held, now felt like a broken toy under the old man's sharp gaze. The old man didn't need to say much, didn't need to raise a hand. His silence struck like a fatal blow to the officer's self-respect, making him feel utterly powerless. The officer realized he had been wrong to underestimate this man. The feeling of failure began to creep into his mind. Everything he had once trusted now seemed like a joke. He couldn't say anything, only stood there, hesitating in the face of the old man's challenge. The old man no longer wasted time. After a powerful silence, he gently picked up the phone and said, "They'll know right after this call." It was a soft statement, yet it carried a strong confirmation. Officer Rivers stood motionless, unable to utter a word. The old man's words were like an unshakable command, as if he had foreseen everything before it happened. The officer's confusion grew stronger with every passing moment. He realized he was in a situation he couldn't control. Officer Rivers knew that, even if he could stop the old man now, the consequences couldn't be prevented, and the old man had placed the entire system in a difficult position. Joseph Taylor turned and walked away without looking back. His actions were unhurried, showing no urgency, yet carried a clear sense of determination. Officer Rivers and his 2 colleagues could only stand and watch, powerless to act. Their eyes followed the old man's retreating figure, but the confusion in their minds only deepened. The old man had completely turned the tables, making those in power, who thought they could manipulate everything, now face an undeniable truth. No further words or forceful actions were needed. The old man had changed everything with just one phone call. The story they thought would end quickly now opened a new chapter they could never have predicted. After the video of Joseph Taylor's incident began to spread widely on social media platforms, the community could no longer stay silent. Social organizations, human rights groups, and politicians began to speak out strongly, criticizing the actions of the police. The condemnation didn't stop at the local level, it spread across the nation. Senators, celebrities, and social activists quickly posted messages demanding an investigation and urgent action to protect citizens' rights. The story of the old man became a symbol of the fight against racism and police abuse of power, making many people realize that injustice had gone too far. Social organizations, those fighting for the rights of Black people and minority communities, immediately organized meetings and protests to push for strict action against abusive police officers. At the same time, protests against the police began to erupt in major cities, from New York to Los Angeles. Powerful slogans like "Justice for Joseph" and "End Police Brutality" echoed through the streets. The protesters not only opposed the police officers' actions in the arrest of the old man, but also demanded comprehensive reform in the police system to protect the basic rights of all citizens, regardless of their race or background. Thousands of people flooded the streets, of all ages and genders, speaking out together for justice. The protests didn't just take place in major cities but also spread to smaller towns, where issues of racism and police abuse were often overlooked. However, the old man's story had caused a huge shock, making everyone reflect on the state of society today. Photos and videos from the protests were quickly shared on social media, drawing the attention of international media. Journalists from major television stations continually updated the situation, turning the event into a hot topic and forcing the government to take action. Tensions in society grew as the police and government faced a wave of public outrage. The officers involved in the old man's arrest began to face harsh criticism. The government could no longer ignore the issue. Public pressure forced them to implement stronger measures, calling for a thorough and decisive investigation. Meetings between the government, social organizations, and protesters began to occur more frequently, discussing how to reform the police force and specific actions to stop racism in society. Those participating in the protests not only demanded harsh action against the abusive officers, but also called for a transparent, fair justice system for all. scale. International human rights organizations also joined the movement. Several major organizations spoke out, calling on authorities to investigate the incident and make recommendations for comprehensive police reform. Groups fighting for the rights of the Black community began to intensify their campaigns on social media, urging people to join the movement for justice. Every day, these online campaigns grew stronger, thousands of people participating, sharing posts, and calling for action. Hashtags like #JusticeForJoseph and #End Police Brutality became trending topics, drawing the attention of not only those in the community but also those outside of it, who were increasingly realizing the need for change in how society treats the vulnerable. The incident involving the old man had become more than just a story about an isolated case of abuse. It had turned into a symbol of the long struggle against injustice in the legal and executive systems. Social activists began advocating for a major reform in police recruitment and training, while demanding transparency in all actions taken by the police force. These demands were not only focused on handling individual abusive officers, but also called for systemic change to ensure no one would suffer from racial discrimination and police violence again. Soon after, politicians began to realize that this was a major social issue that could not be ignored any longer. They started participating in discussions about police system reform, aiming not only to improve the way the police force operates, but also to make justice more accessible to all citizens, regardless of who they were. These debates were not easy, but they opened a new path for society, one where everyone had the right to be treated fairly. Along with the protests, political and social campaigns gained momentum. Organizations like Black Lives Matter and groups protecting minority communities organized numerous marches and seminars, drawing thousands of participants. These seminars were not only aimed at raising awareness but also pushing for tangible action from the community and government. They held events to educate people about their rights, what they could do to fight against racism, and how to demand change from the system. The community no longer stood on the sidelines. They had found their voice in the story of the old man, and now they were standing up to demand justice for him and for all others who had been oppressed. This movement didn't stop at a single incident, but became a revolution for human rights and equality in society. Justice was no longer a distant dream. It was a right that all of us could demand, and no one could take it away. The police and government could no longer be arrogant or complacent with their past actions. The community's outrage had forced them to face the truth, to admit that they could not continue to exist in a society where power was unchecked. The protests continued strongly, and this battle, though just beginning, had opened a new era for justice and fairness. After the video of Joseph Taylor's incident was widely shared, social media exploded with outrage. From Facebook and Twitter to Instagram, every platform was flooded with posts, videos, and comments condemning the actions of the police. Millions of shares quickly made the old man's story not just a singular event, but a major social issue, attracting attention not only from the domestic community but also from around the world. His story was no longer just an individual's pain, but had become a powerful call for justice. Each shared video acted as an accusation, not only against the actions of the officers involved in the arrest, but also against the police system, which had long been considered innocent but lacked oversight, creating an environment ripe for abuse of power. Social media was not only a platform for people to speak out, but it became the foundation for a movement where everyone could contribute to the fight for justice. Hashtags like #JusticeForJoseph and #End Police Brutality began to appear in abundance, and they became symbols of this struggle. Similar stories about racial discrimination and police abuse began to be shared, further fueling outrage within the community. The old man's story was no longer just his own. It became the story of anyone who had ever been treated unjustly, a voice for those who could not protect themselves. The government could no longer remain on the sidelines. Public pressure grew stronger, and that pressure began to force political leaders to face the reality that they could no longer ignore the situation. Discussions in parliamentary committees, emergency government meetings, all focused on a single issue. Justice must be served for Joseph Taylor, and the officers involved in the abuse must be punished. However, the more the government worked with social organizations and reviewed public demands, the more they realized that a mere preliminary investigation would not solve the issue. This was not a matter of an individual, but a systemic issue, a deep-rooted problem in the way the police force enforces the law. The sense of failure began to manifest among the leaders as they realized that the community had become too determined in demanding change. Human rights organizations began to take concrete actions to increase pressure on the government. They not only condemned the actions of the officers in the old man's case, but also called for stronger measures. Campaigns were organized everywhere, not only calling for justice for the old man but also pushing for comprehensive police reform. Slogans like "No more police brutality," "Justice for all," and "Police must serve the people, not oppress," were posted on walls, electronic boards, and on every street corner. Activist organizations demanded not just accountability for the individuals involved, but also a thorough investigation to clarify police procedures, demanding change in how this force operates. The outrage within the community continued to grow. Marches, protests, and meetings by human rights groups became more frequent. Racial discrimination in society could no longer be ignored, and more people were speaking out. Joseph Taylor, though just one individual among millions affected by this system, had become the powerful voice of protest against a system that had long seemed immune to societal oversight. Photos and videos of the protests, with powerful slogans like "Justice for all," were spread across social media, forcing the government to take notice. The government could no longer remain silent on an issue that was shaking society to its core. The outrage was not confined to major cities but spread to rural areas, where people began to realize they could no longer accept a system where those in power could abuse their authority without facing consequences. Social organizations increased their pressure on the government, demanding strong decisions to end racism within the police force and society. Meetings between human rights organizations and political leaders began to occur more frequently. At each meeting, demands for police reform and changes in law enforcement were increasingly emphasized. Then, an important event occurred. The largest protest ever was organized right in front of the courthouse, where calls for justice were heard from all over the country. Thousands of people from cities and towns gathered to express their outrage, to demand justice for the old man and all those who had been victims of abuse. The slogan, "Justice for Joseph," echoed everywhere. This protest wasn't just to condemn the wrongful actions of the police officers, but a campaign demanding police system reform and a change in how all citizens were treated. The cries of "Justice for all" were not just a call for Joseph Taylor, but a reminder that human rights could not be trampled. For those participating in the protest, justice was not a distant concept, but a fundamental right that everyone must have the power to demand and protect. This protest was not just an event, but the first step in a long struggle against injustice. These protests were not only calling for action in one specific case, but a reminder of a system that needed to be changed to protect the rights of everyone. The community was not just standing up for the old man anymore, but for a greater ideal, justice, and equality for all. After the video of Joseph Taylor's incident went viral on social media, the authorities could no longer ignore the pressure from public opinion. An official investigation was launched, and all officers involved in the arrest now had to face formal questioning. Things were no longer as simple as before, and the situation had escalated beyond a typical abuse of power case. The wave of protests from the community grew stronger, demanding that the authorities clarify the actions of the police force in this case. The evidence from the video was handed over to the investigators, and a major shift was beginning to take place in how this case would be handled. The officers, who were once in power, now had to face the scrutiny of the law. Officer Mark Rivers, who was directly involved in the arrest, was the first to be summoned for questioning. The officer entered the interrogation room with a tense expression, but still tried to maintain a facade of false confidence. He was used to handling similar situations, but this time was different, and he knew that things would not be easy. When questioned about his actions, Rivers could not avoid offering a defense. "We were just doing our job," he said, trying to rationalize his actions as if following orders was the only reason. However, these justifications could not mask the recklessness in his actions. A sense of unease began to rise in Rivers as the investigators' questions became sharper. He realized that his words were no longer convincing and were gradually becoming weaker. The brutal actions toward the old man, which he had once thought were justified, now stood as undeniable evidence. Rivers couldn't clearly explain why the old man was arrested without any visible resistance or clear wrongdoing. The following questions only made him more confused, forcing him to face an undeniable truth. With every question, Rivers' anxiety deepened. He began to realize that not only was he, but the entire police system, facing a much more serious issue than he had imagined. His arguments began to lose their persuasiveness, and he couldn't help but feel that he was falling into a weakened position. His testimony could no longer hide the truth that the community had clearly seen in the video. Officer Rivers gradually realized that this was no longer just his issue, but one that concerned the entire police force and a society rising up to demand justice. The truth was becoming clearer, and his recklessness in action, along with his abuse of power, had become an irrefutable factor. A sense of helplessness overwhelmed Rivers as he realized that this incident might change not only his future, but also a part of the system he had once trusted. The video footage of the incident quickly became powerful evidence against the actions of Officer Mark Rivers and his colleagues. The sharp, clear footage not only showed the brutality in how Joseph Taylor was treated, but also highlighted the blatant racism and abuse of power by the police officers. The video captured every moment, from the officer demanding the old man kneel without any reasonable cause to violently subduing him, making it impossible for the community to ignore that this was an unlawful act. These videos proved that the police were not only acting outside the law but also abusing their power, something many in society had never fully recognized before. The rudeness and deprivation of the rights of an innocent citizen were fully documented, rendering the officers' justifications meaningless. The video was not only crucial evidence in uncovering the truth, but also a powerful indictment of the racial discrimination existing in a system that was supposed to be just. Each detail in the video made the truth clearer and also left the authorities no room to ignore or protect these wrongful acts anymore. As the videos spread widely, the pressure from the community grew stronger. Other officers in the department began to realize that they could be implicated in the investigation. This was no longer about one individual, but about a system, a culture within the police force that was now being exposed. The images in the video highlighted their misconduct, and now, all the officers involved in the incident could face serious consequences. Rivers' colleagues could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Discussions within the department slowly shifted from mutual protection to anxiety about what would happen next. The pressure began to mount, not only on Officer Rivers, but also on the other officers in the department, as they realized that this case could affect their careers and futures. The tension within the police force became apparent, with each officer starting to wonder whether they could be implicated in the investigation. Questions about their own integrity began to arise, and this pressure only grew stronger as the video was made public on social media, attracting attention from not just the community but also human rights organizations, politicians, and the media. Officer Rivers and the others were no longer simply law enforcers, but were now under scrutiny and questioning for their actions. Discussions within the police department were no longer about protecting one another but about self-preservation. Every glance now carried anxiety. Each testimony, each detail in the video, had clarified everything. The incident was no longer just a mistake by one officer. It was part of a system that needed to change. The officers in the department realized that they could no longer hide the truth, and this only heightened the tension and unease among them. Officer Rivers increasingly felt the weight of public opinion, recognizing that without decisive action from the authorities, he and his colleagues would have to face unavoidable consequences. The justifications were no longer effective, and no one in the department could escape the truth that had been exposed before the public. The pressure from the public, the opposition from the community, and the human rights organizations made this matter more serious than ever. Officers who once believed their power was absolute now had to confront harsh truths they could no longer deny. Judges and lawyers involved in the Joseph Taylor case began to thoroughly review the new evidence from the investigation. The video clips, witness testimonies, and, most importantly, the calls between the old man and the Supreme Court began to emerge. These calls, which had previously seemed like a small detail no one noticed, now became the key factor in uncovering the truth. The video footage of the officer's brutality towards the old man had sparked outrage in the community. But now, the old man's calls were the most important clue. Each call was clearly and thoroughly recorded, and the exchanges between the old man and powerful figures in the Supreme Court began to unveil the influence he held. These calls were not just ordinary communications, powerful evidence showing that the old man was not an unknown, weak, elderly person who could be easily bullied. Every word he spoke in those calls carried strength, a power that could not be ignored. The story of the old man gradually became clearer throughout the investigation. The initial details, thought to be merely the actions of an abused citizen, were clarified, and the true power of the old man was exposed. Joseph Taylor was not just an ordinary person, he was a figure with significant influence in the country's legal system. People began to realize that the old man had once played a key role in the establishment of this legal system. His calmness, his silence in confronting the officer, now became a sign that he was not someone anyone could easily subdue. In those calls, he had connected with influential people, individuals whom the officers never could have expected. The old man was not just a voice in the Supreme Court, he was a figure with real influence over important decisions in the national judicial system. This revelation forced all the officers involved in the incident to face a truth they could not deny. They were not confronting a frail old man, but someone with real power and influence in the legal world. The judges and lawyers in the investigation realized that this was not just an individual case, but a larger issue concerning how the legal system and power structures in society functioned. The truth about the old man gradually made the officers feel that they were in a losing position. They were not only facing criticism from the community, but also serious legal consequences. With his calm and strategic demeanor, the old man had lifted the veil on his own power, forcing everyone to realize that their previous assumptions about him were entirely wrong. Although the evidence from the investigation increasingly clarified their misconduct, the police officers involved in the arrest of Joseph Taylor continued to find ways to deny responsibility. Officer Mark Rivers, who directly participated in the abuse of power, attempted to justify his actions with vague and unconvincing reasons. He claimed he was just doing his job, that asking the old man to stop and check his papers was a legal action within the scope of his duty. However, these justifications were no longer valid. The videos clearly showed that his actions were not only reckless, but also displayed clear signs of racial discrimination. Despite Rivers' efforts to stand his ground, the truth became clearer, and he could no longer hide the abuse of power that occurred in this situation. The issue did not stop with Rivers. The other officers present in the incident also began to try to justify their actions. One of them attempted to blame the circumstances, claiming they were put in a stressful situation and that their actions were necessary to control the situation. However, the truth that the community had witnessed through the video made their explanations even weaker. The community spoke out strongly, and human rights organizations made firm demands for action against the police misconduct. The resistance from the police was no longer strong enough to counter the outrage from the public and human rights groups. Their excuses seemed to convince no one, and it became increasingly clear that their actions would face consequences. The official investigation was now being taken seriously, with the involvement of relevant authorities and influential lawyers and judges. Officer Rivers and the others involved could no longer protect themselves from increasingly sharp questions. They had to face difficult questions that could no longer be answered with vague reasoning or justifications as before. The investigation no longer focused on verifying a few minor details but delved deeper, expanding to many aspects of the case. Important elements in the investigation gradually emerged, from the phone exchanges between the old man and powerful figures in the Supreme Court to the video footage capturing the officer's brutality. The old man, with his patience and calm, became an essential witness, guiding the investigation in the right direction. Key details began to emerge, and the investigation had now entered a decisive phase. The officers could no longer protect themselves with vague reasons. They had to face the truth that they had made a serious mistake, and their actions could no longer be justified. Questions about abuse of power, racism, and irresponsibility in the execution of their duties had taken this case far beyond a typical arrest, turning it into a much larger issue. The tension increased, and the pressure from the community, along with the scrutiny from the authorities, grew stronger, forcing the officers to confront a truth they could no longer deny. After the case of Joseph Taylor attracted widespread attention, human rights organizations and the community began organizing protests and marches. Thousands of people from various regions took to the streets, not only to protest the actions of the police, but also to demand a change in the actions and attitudes of the police force toward the community. The protests took place not only in major cities like New York and Los Angeles, but also spread to smaller areas where issues of racism and police abuse were less frequently highlighted. The call for justice for Joseph Taylor became a collective voice for those who felt oppressed and unjustly treated. Photos of the march, Slogans like "Justice for Joseph" and "End Police Brutality" appeared everywhere, becoming iconic symbols for this struggle. Those participating were not only demanding justice for one individual, but also calling for change across the entire police system to protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or ethnicity. The public reaction was so strong that the government could no longer ignore it. Calls for justice rose higher, not only from social organizations but also from groups that had previously remained silent. Human rights organizations spoke out forcefully, demanding that authorities not only investigate the incident but also implement immediate reforms in police conduct. The community began to realize the extent of the racism and abuse of power they had endured over the years. Black advocacy groups and human rights organizations reconnected, forming a powerful force. Their voices could no longer be ignored. The media began to take notice, and reporters relentlessly covered the ongoing protests. It was no longer a personal issue for Joseph Taylor, but a societal issue. Those fighting for justice were not only calling for justice for him but also demanding stronger measures to stop racial discrimination across all aspects of life. Social organizations began to push for comprehensive change, especially in the training and conduct of police forces. Meetings and discussions between human rights organizations and politicians became more frequent. Legislators and social leaders could no longer stay on the sidelines. The outrage from the community and the event itself forced them to join the dialogue on police reform. Justice was no longer just a demand for one case, but a demand for all those who had been oppressed. The discussions were no longer just about dealing with the behavior of one officer, but also about the necessary changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. The police force needed to be held accountable for their actions, but society also needed reform to ensure that such behavior would not be allowed to happen again. Social activist groups were not only calling for specific actions against the officers involved, but also demanding a more transparent and fair justice system. Reforms in police training and oversight were presented as an urgent need. The community's involvement in this struggle was not just about one person or one incident, but about an entire generation of people who were exhausted by injustice. The community no longer stayed silent in the face of racism and police abuse of power. Protests grew larger, campaigns became stronger, and the culmination was the largest protest in front of the courthouse, where thousands gathered to express their outrage and demand justice. It was the first step in the fight against injustice, but it was also a crucial step in the revolution for justice for everyone, regardless of race, color, or gender. The community stood up, and they could not be extinguished. Their strength made it impossible for the government to continue ignoring the demands for reform. The outrage from the community no longer stopped at social media criticisms or isolated articles. The police and government now faced undeniable pressure from human rights organizations, the citizens calling for justice, and especially from the very community affected. The protests, marches, and campaigns for justice for Joseph Taylor began to heat up, drawing national attention. Television stations, newspapers, and media outlets started widely covering the protest. The calls for justice for Joseph echoed from everywhere, and banners and slogans demanding justice began appearing on streets, in meetings, and across all media platforms. This made it impossible for the government to ignore. They could no longer dismiss the rising demands for change from the community. The police's actions were no longer a personal matter, but a systemic issue, and now, addressing the abusive officers became a societal emergency. The pressure from the community continued to rise, demanding not only justice for Joseph Taylor, but also a comprehensive reform in how the police force operated. Social and human rights organizations began intensifying their campaigns, urging those in authority to act. The community was no longer just watching. They had become part of this struggle, demanding that the government take action. Protests were no longer confined to the streets, but also appeared at conferences, political meetings, where leaders were called upon to provide satisfactory answers for the wrongful actions of the police. Prosecuting and convicting the abusive officers had become the first step in the fight for justice. The community demanded a clear change, not just punishment for the individuals at fault, but a fundamental shift in the police system and how they treated citizens. Campaigns were not just calling for the correction of misconduct, but also pushing for comprehensive reforms, from retraining officers to overseeing their actions. The tension in society stemmed not only from the outrage of the protesters, but also from the growing questions that the government could no longer avoid. The community demanded immediate change and would not accept any delays. The protests continued. Human rights groups kept pushing campaigns, and they called called on the government to take concrete steps in reforming the police system. These organizations demanded a public, transparent investigation and harsh action against officers who abused their power. Any delay would only increase the community's anger. The community was demanding justice, not just for the old man, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly. The consequences of this outrage were not only the awakening of the community, but also a wake-up call for those in power, those at the head of the police force and the government. This was not just about restoring justice for one person, but about restoring justice for society as a whole, so no one would be treated unjustly again. The story of Joseph Taylor was no longer a personal incident. It had become a symbol of the fight against racism and abuse of power within the police force. This incident sparked a wave of outrage and called for change not only within the community of the old man, but across society as a whole. Support groups, including human rights organizations, disadvantaged communities, and justice advocates, began to rally together and organize large campaigns. Protests, marches, and forums were held continuously to demand that the government and police force change. This movement was no longer just an opposition campaign, but a revolution for human rights, demanding a more transparent and fair justice system. Banners with slogans like "Justice for Joseph Taylor" and "End Racism in the Police" began appearing on streets and social media, creating an unstoppable, powerful wave. As the story of the old man continued to gain attention, influential figures in society began to voice their support for the struggle. Politicians from various parties recognized that the outrage from the community could no longer be ignored. They began participating in the discussion, publicly criticizing police misconduct and calling for stronger measures to end racism in the force. Politicians who had been cautious about speaking out before no longer remained silent. Meetings, congressional sessions, and discussions in the media were quickly organized to address police reform. Celebrities and influential figures also joined the movement. They used their platforms to call for action from the government, demanding comprehensive changes in how the police force operated. These calls were not only focused on punishing the abusive officers, but also on demanding reforms in police training, oversight, and law enforcement practices. This struggle was not limited to a single city or country, but had become an international issue, attracting attention from global human rights organizations. Politicians, not only from within the country but also from abroad, began voicing their support, calling for an international investigation into misconduct within the U.S. police force. The involvement of politicians and celebrities made this movement stronger than ever. It was no longer just the outrage of the community. Those in power within society also began to fight to protect justice and human rights. Political discussions heated up, and reform measures for the police force were seriously considered. The participation of these influential figures not only made the issue more pressing, but also pushed the government to act. The community no longer stood on the sidelines. They had become a powerful force, forcing the government into a position where they had to make decisions. The official struggle began when human rights organizations, black advocacy groups, and political figures started holding meetings and discussions to find solutions to the issue of police abuse of power. The protests continued, and the movement grew stronger with each passing day. The story of the old man not only reminded people of the pains of the past, but also served as a reminder of a future where justice was no longer a distant concept. This movement was not just about seeking justice for one person, but about reclaiming the rights of all those who had been treated unjustly. The marches became larger, thousands of people participating, all with one goal: to demand justice and change. This struggle was not just the fight of an individual, but the fight of an entire community, a society that had long been ignored in debates about justice. The movement for justice for Joseph Taylor was no longer confined to a single city or group of people, but quickly spread nationwide. Calls for justice were coming not only from the oppressed, but also from those who had remained silent, now united to stand against the injustice within the police system. Millions of people from all regions, from major cities to rural areas, joined this movement. Major protests were organized not just in cities like New York and Los Angeles, but also in other areas, where people began to recognize the issue of racism within the police force. Powerful slogans like "Justice for Joseph" and "End Police Brutality" echoed everywhere. From speeches to marches, the participation of millions made this movement one of the strongest struggles against racism in history. The continuous protests attracted national and international media attention as the community demanded not only justice for one person but also called for deep systemic reform in the police force. Speeches and community meetings started taking place everywhere, igniting an unstoppable wave of justice. However, as the movement grew stronger, the police force could no longer stand by without reacting. The officers involved in the arrest of the old man continued to resist, trying to defend their actions. They claimed they were just doing their job and had done nothing wrong. "We were just doing our job," they repeatedly justified, but these words could not hide the truth clearly captured in the videos. No matter how much they tried to defend themselves, public opinion no longer accepted their arguments. The community no longer believed the reasons given by the police, as the images in the video exposed the truth of their abuse of power and racism in a clear manner. People were no longer silent, and with each passing day, the tension in society increased. Human rights organizations, politicians, and social groups continued to push the government to take stronger actions. The police's response gradually became meaningless sighs as the strength of the justice movement grew. The police force, especially the officers under investigation, could no longer hide their wrongdoings before a community filled with outrage and determination for change. The question was no longer whether they had done the right thing, but whether they could face the consequences of their actions. After several months of investigation, the case involving Joseph Taylor had finally reached its decisive stage. The evidence from the videos, witness testimonies, and especially the thorough investigation had revealed the misconduct of the police officers. Under great pressure from public opinion and the community, the court decided to bring the case to trial. The officers involved in the arrest, particularly Officer Mark Rivers, now had to face the consequences of their abuse of power. The case was no longer just an ordinary abuse of power. It had become a symbol of the fight against racism within the police force. Tensions in society were rising, with millions waiting for a fair verdict. The government and relevant authorities had no choice but to face the truth and make a transparent and fair decision. Testimonies from all parties began to be presented in court. The witnesses who were present at the scene were summoned to clarify what had happened that day. Specifically, Officer Rivers and his colleagues had to face direct questions from the lawyers and judges. Sharp and uncompromising questions were asked, forcing the officers to confront the truth they had been trying to deny. Rivers could no longer stand by his position and justify his actions. The questions from the lawyers and judges not only addressed his misconduct, but also delved into the motives and methods the police used in this arrest. Each question felt like an attack on the officers' confidence. They could not avoid the difficult questions, and every excuse they made seemed to highlight the wrongfulness of their actions. Officer Rivers, who had once prided himself on his power, now had to face the undeniable truth. The evidence, the witness testimonies, and the video of his actions had exposed his clear lack of caution and abuse of power. Each question from the lawyers and judges was like a knife piercing through his arguments. "Why did you ask the old man to kneel without a reasonable cause?" was a simple question that left Rivers unable to find an answer. "Did your actions exceed the authority of a police officer?" This question made him even more uncomfortable. Officer Rivers tried to justify himself, but the more he spoke, the more his contradictions became apparent. There were no reasonable explanations left, no confidence, only confusion and helplessness. The trial became increasingly tense as the details of the case came to light. The officers' inability to explain their actions convincingly had forced not only the public but also those within the police force to reconsider how the force carries out its duties. The appearance of the video capturing the brutality had clarified everything. And now, not only Officer Rivers but his colleagues as well had to take responsibility for their actions. The verdict the court was about to deliver was not just personal punishment but also a warning to the entire police force that they could no longer abuse their power without facing consequences. This event would not only change the lives of the involved officers but also mark a turning point in changing how the police force interacts with citizens, especially marginalized communities. The trial took place in a tense atmosphere, with each testimony and piece of evidence presented sharply, shedding light on the wrongful actions of the officers. The lawyers, witnesses, and participants in the trial all sought to prove that the actions of the police were not only an abuse of power, but also a serious violation of citizens' rights. The video clips showing the officers demanding Joseph Taylor kneel without any valid reason, their shouting and rough demeanor, all became crucial evidence against the officers' actions. The sharp questions from the lawyers not only aimed to clarify the officers' misconduct, but also highlighted their recklessness and blind behavior. The officers, who had always taken pride in their power, could not provide a reasonable explanation for their actions. They were not only being cross-examined, but also faced direct questions from the judge, questions that made them realize the flaws in their arguments. The trial became a struggle between justice and the defense of power. A struggle in which the police seemed unable to continue justifying their actions. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, only weakened their position, making it impossible for them to defend their past mistakes. As the trial came to a close, the verdict was delivered, causing everyone in the courtroom to hold their breath. The officers involved, after hours of questioning and facing undeniable evidence, were convicted of abuse of power and human rights violations. However, this verdict did not bring satisfaction to everyone. While they were convicted, the severity of the sentence caused controversy. The community, especially those supporting the old man and human rights organizations, felt that the sentence was not strong enough and did not reflect the seriousness of the officers' actions. They argued that convicting the officers without applying appropriate punishment was an injustice, a wrong signal to other officers, allowing them to continue abusing their power without facing severe consequences. Discontent surged within the community as the verdict failed to meet their expectations. Human rights organizations continued to speak out, demanding stronger penalties and calling for widespread reforms within the police force to stop abuse of power and racism. The community continued to push for more active campaigns, urging the government to take stronger measures to protect citizens' rights and end the abuse of power in law enforcement. Protests and marches continued, and the story of Joseph Taylor was not just about seeking justice for one person, but about seeking justice for all those oppressed and deprived of their rights. The community was not only waiting for a verdict, but demanding a complete overhaul in the way justice is enforced. After the court's verdict against the officers in the Joseph Taylor case, the government began to face increasing pressure from the community and human rights organizations. Public outrage was no longer limited to the handling of the offending officers, but extended to demanding a comprehensive reform of the police system. The call for change in how the police force operates became an urgent demand that could not be delayed any longer. Human rights organizations and oppressed communities continued to press the government for specific actions to improve the situation and stop racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police force. The government began to realize that it could no longer maintain the old system where abuse of power and racial discrimination went unchecked. Therefore, after a series of meetings and discussions, the government decided to implement significant reforms in the police force's operations to ensure that such misconduct would never happen again. To implement these reforms, the government began focusing on changing the police training process. New training programs were launched to improve officers' awareness of racial discrimination, abuse of power, and other forms of misconduct. Courses began to be held with the goal of helping police officers better understand citizens' rights and the responsibilities they bear when carrying out their duties. The lessons focused on raising awareness about racial differences and the negative impact of racial discrimination in communities. Officers were required to participate in communication training programs to help them handle situations more calmly and fairly, rather than using brute force. Lessons on respecting human rights and justice were also included in the new training programs, helping officers understand that they do not have absolute power over everyone, but that they are there to serve and protect citizens' rights. This change in training processes was not just limited to theoretical instruction, but also included practical methods that allowed officers to learn and apply the knowledge immediately in their daily work. Simulated scenarios were created in the training sessions to help officers deal with stressful situations they might encounter on the job without resorting to violence. Conflict resolution skills were taught to help officers handle tense situations reasonably without escalating violence or discrimination. Changing the police training approach not only helped improve their professional skills, but also created a police force that understands and respects human rights, without discrimination based on race or background. In addition, these reforms also include the establishment of independent oversight bodies to monitor the behavior of the police. These agencies will be responsible for investigating and handling cases involving abuse of power, ensuring that the police force will not have the ability to freely misuse its power. These agencies will operate independently, free from external influence, ensuring objectivity and fairness in handling cases. The creation of these oversight bodies is an important step toward establishing transparency in police operations and helping the public feel more secure when interacting with officers in their daily work. These changes have been strongly supported by the community, with the hope that they will help build a police force that serves justice and protects the rights of all individuals, regardless of race, color, or social status. While the reforms were implemented with the goal of improving transparency and fairness in police operations, not all police officers agree with these changes. Some officers feel that the new measures, particularly the regulations regarding the oversight of their actions and the training programs on racism, are too extreme and infringe upon their freedom to act. They argue that these new procedures reduce the effectiveness of their work, hindering their ability to respond quickly in emergency situations. These officers believe that the strict monitoring of their actions will prevent them from carrying out their duties effectively, as they will constantly fear being watched and judged for every small action. This opposition stems from the belief that the police force should have the freedom to act without excessive intervention from external organizations or oversight bodies. These officers are confident in their abilities and argue that it is the external interference that undermines the effectiveness of police work. Meanwhile, reform supporters argue that it was the lack of oversight and excessive freedom of action in the past that led to abuse of power and racism within the police force. Public protests and campaigns have made the public realize that the police cannot continue to operate without strict oversight. Reform is necessary not only to prevent abuse of power but also to protect the rights of all citizens, especially vulnerable communities. Those opposing the reforms feel they are being treated like criminals, but reform supporters assert that this is an opportunity to rebuild trust between the community and the police force, ensuring that all citizens, regardless of race or background, are treated fairly. However, despite opposition from some members of the police force, these reforms were implemented and have brought significant progress in changing the way the police operate. One of the largest steps in the reform process was the establishment of independent oversight agencies. These agencies not only oversee the behavior of police officers while performing their duties but also handle complaints from citizens, ensuring that each action of the police is thoroughly examined and evaluated fairly. This not only helps create transparency in law enforcement but also helps the community feel more secure when interacting with the police. These changes have helped eliminate the lack of transparency and unchecked power within the police force, while also increasing public trust in the authorities. In addition to establishing oversight agencies, the reforms also included changes to the police training program. Courses on justice, human rights, and conflict resolution were introduced into the official training curriculum. Police officers are now required to participate in courses that help them develop a deeper understanding of racial discrimination, the importance of respecting human rights, and how to handle situations without resorting to violence. These programs not only help officers work more effectively, but also help them understand their responsibility in protecting justice and the rights of all citizens. These courses also emphasize the importance of communication and listening to citizens' perspectives, particularly in high-tension situations. This advancement is crucial in ensuring that the police force's duty is not only to enforce the law but also to serve the community fairly and responsibly. These reforms not only change the way the police operate but also alter the public's perception of them. Reforming the police system is not a revolution that happens overnight, but it is the first and important step toward building a more just society where every citizen can trust in the fairness of the law. While there are still many challenges and opposition from a portion of the police force, these changes will undoubtedly open the door to a future where justice is applied without discrimination, abuse of power, or injustice. After the police reforms began to be implemented, these changes quickly gained strong support from the community and social organizations. The protests and marches demanding justice for Joseph Taylor created a powerful wave not only in the U.S. but also in many other countries. Those participating in these movements were not only opposing the police's racist behavior but also calling for a more just society where the rights of every citizen are protected. Social organizations, from human rights groups to those advocating for the rights of Black communities, continued to urge the government and relevant authorities to carry out comprehensive reforms. They realized that to change the situation, there had to be a fundamental shift in how the police force operates and interacts with citizens, especially vulnerable communities. Debates within the community, especially in the political sphere and among human rights organizations, gradually became stronger. Reform supporters recognized that Joseph Taylor's case was not an isolated incident, part of a larger issue: racial discrimination within the police force and society in general. These groups called for the government to take specific steps to address racial discrimination, including reforming police recruitment and training, implementing independent oversight, and ensuring transparency in all actions by the force. The participation of social organizations and politicians gave this reform movement more strength and presence in society. The government could no longer ignore the call for change. Public pressure, along with pressure from social organizations, created a strong wave demanding further reforms, helping the community and human rights organizations see a more just future where all citizens could trust the legal system and police force. The community, with its large and enthusiastic participation, was truly awakened by this case. The story of Joseph Taylor roused people from their indifference to the issue of racial discrimination, a problem long overlooked in society. The police's brutal actions forced society to confront the truth that racism still exists within law enforcement, and this could no longer be ignored. The community recognized that discriminatory behavior could not be accepted in modern society. Every individual, regardless of skin color or background, has the right to be treated fairly and protected from all forms of discrimination. This is the lesson the community learned after witnessing this case. Joseph Taylor's story, although starting from what seemed like a simple situation, became the catalyst for a major societal reform. The protests, gatherings, and media campaigns helped raise awareness about the injustice in society and pushed forward the struggle for justice for all people. Joseph Taylor's case helped the community understand that justice is not a distant concept but a fundamental right that every citizen has the right to demand. This awakening was not only about resolving one case, but about creating a comprehensive change in how society addresses issues of racial discrimination. Those involved in this movement recognized that this was an opportunity to promote a more equal and just society. The reforms in the police force, the changes in police training, and the oversight of their actions all became crucial steps toward rebuilding trust in the legal system. The community did not rise up just for one individual, for a greater ideal, the ideal of justice and equality for all, regardless of race, skin color, or social status. The story of Joseph Taylor has sparked a powerful wave in the community, helping them realize that change is both possible and necessary. These reforms, though only the first step, have laid a solid foundation for a fairer future. The community is no longer standing by. They have become a part of this change, a change to ensure that no one has to endure discrimination or abuse of power again. Justice, now, is no longer something distant, but a right that everyone can and must demand. Human rights organizations have continued to fight to ensure that the police's abuse of power will not happen again. After Joseph Taylor's case, these organizations became the leading forces in demanding comprehensive reform in the police system. The racial discrimination, brutality, and abuse of power that had been overlooked and not seriously addressed for so long have now come to the forefront. From groups advocating for the rights of Black people to those fighting for social justice, these organizations have increased pressure on the government and authorities. They demanded not only a public and transparent investigation into the police's misconduct, but also a fundamental change in how the police force operates. Reforms in recruitment, training, and oversight of police actions became key objectives that they continuously pushed for. These organizations didn't just stop at calls for change, but actively participated in campaigns, protests, and media initiatives to create lasting societal change. Their goal was not just to punish the individuals at fault, but to improve the police system and build a fairer legal environment for everyone. Human rights organizations have emphasized that reforming the police force is not just a solution to the current situation, but a necessary step to protect citizens' fundamental rights in the future. At the same time, these reforms have opened up hope for a fairer future, where justice is no longer a privilege of a few, but a right for everyone. Justice, in the eyes of those participating in this movement, is not just an abstract concept, but a specific right that every individual can and must demand. In the past, those who were oppressed or discriminated against had to accept unjust treatment without recourse. But now, with these reforms and the change in the police system, justice is no longer something distant. The protests, campaigns, and calls for justice have created a wave of change in society, making everyone realize that all individuals have the right to be protected and treated fairly under the law. The reforms in the police force are not only a step forward in changing how law enforcement is carried out, but also a sign that society is entering a new era where justice is no longer manipulated by power but must serve everyone. Human rights organizations, politicians, and those fighting for the rights of oppressed communities all clearly see that this change is not limited to reforming the police force, but also an opportunity to create a more just and equal society. Every step in the reform process, every effort to raise awareness about citizens' rights, not only helps stop racial discrimination within the police, but also lays the groundwork for a future where everyone is treated equally, regardless of race, gender, or background. These reforms represent a profound societal change, and while there are still challenges and obstacles ahead, they also create a new trust in the legal system. Those who have endured discrimination can now see a future where justice truly belongs to all, not just a group or community. The community is no longer just standing by. They have become the driving force in pushing for change, and the hope for a fairer future is clearer than ever. After the incident involving Joseph Taylor, a powerful movement began to form within society, attracting the participation of those from oppressed communities. The Black community, minority groups, and others who had long remained silent about racial discrimination within the police force started to become more aware of the injustices in the actions of law enforcement. Events like the arrest of Joseph Taylor were no longer seen as isolated incidents, but rather part of a long-standing system of abuse of power and racial discrimination. People from all regions, from large cities to rural areas, began to realize that this was an issue for society as a whole, not just for a specific community or group. The actions of the police, the instances of abuse that were once overlooked or downplayed, have now become a major issue that all citizens must face. Human rights organizations and equality advocacy groups gradually began to unite, forming a powerful wave demanding change in the entire police system. The community no longer stood by. They recognized that change must come through restructuring and reforming the way the police force operates to ensure that every citizen, regardless of race or background, is treated equally under the law. The community's response didn't stop at speaking out. It took on many different forms. Public discussions began to take place widely, from social forums to schools, where people began questioning power and racial discrimination in modern society. In schools, from high school to college, discussions about injustice and power in society became essential lessons. Students began organizing dialogues, group discussions about racism, how the police force enforces the law, and whether they are truly serving justice. Student groups, college organizations, and community groups began sharing information and organizing events to raise awareness about this issue. Speeches about justice, fairness, and citizens' rights were held not only in schools but also in local communities. Questions about power, how the police system is built and enforced, were no longer strange. They became hot topics, openly and powerfully discussed. People began to question a system that they once considered inviolable. They began thinking about what could be changed within that system to end racial discrimination and abuse of power. Conversations about power were no longer just between the oppressed oppressed, but had become an issue for everyone in society. The community gradually realized that their rights could not be ignored, and they had a responsibility to fight for justice, not just for one individual but for all citizens in society. The story of Joseph Taylor sparked a powerful wave within the community, helping them realize that change is not only possible but necessary. These reforms, although just the first step, laid a strong foundation for a more equitable future. The community no longer stood on the sidelines. They became an integral part of this change, a change to ensure that no one would have to endure discrimination or abuse of power again. Justice, now, is not a distant ideal but a right that everyone can and must demand. Human rights organizations continued to fight to ensure that police abuses would not recur. After the Joseph Taylor incident, these organizations became pioneers in calling for comprehensive reform in the police system. Acts of racial discrimination, brutality, and abuse of power, long ignored or downplayed, were now at the forefront of national conversation. Human rights groups, from those advocating for black rights to those pushing for social justice, began to intensify pressure on the government and authorities. They didn't just demand a public and transparent investigation into the abusive police officers, but also called for a fundamental change in the way police forces operate. Reforms in recruitment, training, and oversight of police actions became key objectives that they relentlessly advocated for. These organizations not only voiced their demands but also actively participated in campaigns, protests, and media movements aimed at creating lasting societal change. Their goal wasn't just to punish those who violated laws but to improve the police system and build a more just legal environment for all. Human rights organizations affirmed that reforming the police was not just a remedy for the current situation but an essential step to protect citizens' fundamental rights in the future. At the same time, these reforms also opened the door to hope for a more just future, where justice is no longer a privilege for a select group, but a right for all. For those involved in this movement, justice was not just an abstract concept, but a specific right that every individual could and must demand. Previously, those oppressed or discriminated against had to accept unjust treatment with no recourse. But now, with these reforms and changes in the police system, justice was no longer a distant concept. The protests, the advocacy campaigns, and the calls for justice created a ripple effect in society, making everyone realize that all people have the right to protection and to be treated fairly under the law. The reforms in the police force were not just a step in changing how law enforcement operates, but also a sign that society was entering a new era, where justice would no longer be manipulated by power but would serve all people equally. Human rights organizations, politicians, and advocates for oppressed communities all recognized that this change wasn't just about reforming the police, but also an opportunity to create a more equal and just society. Every step in reform, every effort to raise awareness about citizens' rights, not only helps stop racial discrimination in police forces but also lays the groundwork for a future where everyone is treated equally, regardless of race, gender, or background. These reforms are a profound societal shift, and although there are still challenges and resistance ahead, they also create new trust in the legal system. Those who have long suffered from discrimination now see a future where justice truly belongs to everyone, not just one group or community. The community is no longer just watching. They have become the driving force for change, and hope for a more just future is clearer than ever before. After the incident involving Joseph Taylor, human rights organizations began calling for reform not only in the police force, but also in the education and political systems to ensure that power and racial discrimination no longer persisted. Recent events have shown that it is not just the police force, but many societal systems that need to change to meet the demands for justice. These organizations are urging the government and relevant authorities to implement comprehensive reforms, including raising awareness about racism and abuse of power, starting from the educational environment. Teaching about human rights, justice, and equality has become a crucial topic in schools. Human rights organizations demand that educational policies be adjusted so that future generations understand the value of fairness and social responsibility. They also call for political reforms, especially ensuring fair representation of disadvantaged communities in governmental bodies. These reforms are not only aimed at addressing the immediate immediate issues, but also ensuring that future generations will not face the injustices that Joseph Taylor experienced. This movement does not stop at the borders of one country. Protests have spread not only across the U.S. but also worldwide, creating a global fight for the rights of the oppressed. Marches, protests, and public gatherings have started to take place in major cities across continents, from Europe, Asia, Africa, to Latin America. Slogans like Black Lives Matter, End Police Brutality, and Justice for All were shouted during these marches. People, regardless of nationality or race, stood up to fight for justice and equality. Images and videos of these protests quickly spread across social media, raising global awareness of police racism and abuse of power in many countries. These protests are not just a response to Joseph Taylor's case, but a collective outcry from the community regarding global issues of human rights, equality, and justice. International human rights organizations have swiftly joined the struggle, calling for governments to change the way they treat minority groups and protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or ethnicity. The movement goes beyond opposing police misconduct. It also advocates for reforms in many other areas of society. Participants in the struggle recognize that in order to build a more just society, all sectors, education, politics, and public institutions must be adjusted to ensure equality and fair treatment for all citizens. The community no longer stands idly by to witness injustice. They have decided to act, bringing about significant changes in how the legal and political systems operate. Social organizations not only call for new policies but also organize advocacy campaigns, lobbying efforts, and events to change public views on racial discrimination. Public discussions about human rights, racial discrimination, and abuse of power have become hot topics in political forums, media outlets, and community meetings. These protests are no longer just places to oppose. They have become platforms for people to share ideas, learn how to create change, and promote equality in society. All these efforts have created a strong wave of change, opening a new chapter in the fight for justice and human rights worldwide. The story of Joseph Taylor sparked a powerful movement within society, attracting the participation of oppressed communities. The Black community, minority groups, and those who had not previously spoken out about racism in law enforcement began to realize the injustice in police actions. Incidents like the arrest of Joseph Taylor were not isolated events, part of a long-standing system of abuse of power and racism. People from all regions, from large cities to rural areas, started to understand that this was a societal issue, not just the problem of one community or group. Police actions and the misconduct were often overlooked or downplayed before they became a major issue that every citizen had to confront. Human rights organizations and equality groups gradually gathered to form a powerful wave calling for change in the entire police system. The community no longer stood on the sidelines. They recognized that change had to come from restructuring and reforming how the police operate to ensure that every citizen, regardless of race or background, was treated fairly under the law. The community's response was not limited to voicing opinions, but also took various forms. Public discussions started to occur widely, from social forums to schools, where people questioned power and racism in modern society. In schools, from high school to university, discussions about injustice and power dynamics became vital lessons. Students and pupils organized dialogues and group discussions about racism, how law enforcement operates, and whether they truly serve justice. School groups, student organizations, and community groups began sharing information, organizing events to raise awareness on these issues. Speeches on justice, fairness, and citizens' rights were held not only in schools but also in neighborhoods. Questions about power, the structure, and implementation of the police system were no longer foreign topics. They became hot subjects, discussed openly and vigorously. People began to question the system they once considered inviolable. They started to think about what could change in that system to stop racial discrimination and abuse of power. Discussions about power were no longer only between the oppressed, but had become a matter for everyone in society. The community gradually realized that their rights could not be ignored, and they had the responsibility to fight for justice, not just for one individual, for all citizens. discussions on racial discrimination became more common, no longer seen as issues that could only be discussed in limited circles. People began to recognize that these issues were not just confined to police actions but existed across all sectors of society, from education and healthcare to the labor market and political systems. Social movements began pointing out that racism wasn't only an issue when a police officer commits misconduct. It is a structural problem deeply embedded in the mechanisms of society, where minority groups don't have the opportunity to thrive, are not treated fairly, and are not protected like others. Discussions in schools, conferences, and online forums expanded to not just focus on police reform, but also on discrimination in education, politics, and employment opportunities. Stories from racially discriminated communities were no longer just individual voices. They were heard and became part of a broader conversation about fairness in society. This shift in awareness did not stop at addressing police reform, but also extended to push for change in the entire social structure. Racism is not only an issue of misconduct, but a complex system embedded in all corners of society. Recognizing that racism is not just an issue for one individual or specific agency, but a problem for society as a whole, opened the door to a revolution in awareness. Through this movement, the younger generations understood that they must fight to break all existing prejudices and discrimination, no matter how long they have existed. They will not accept a society where certain groups are always placed lower, always treated unfairly, just because of their skin color or background. These struggles are not just for justice for one person, but for everyone deprived of their rights in society. Every step of this movement is a step closer to a society where every citizen is treated fairly, without discrimination, and every voice is valued. After a long period of struggle, political and social organizations began to realize that the demand for police reform could no longer be delayed. The strong opposition from the community and human rights organizations pushed politicians to introduce reform bills aimed at curbing police abuse of power and racism. These calls were not only focused on addressing the misconduct of individual officers, but also pushing for systemic change in law enforcement practices. The reform bills included stricter control over police conduct and improvements to their operational processes. Part of the reform was the establishment of independent oversight mechanisms to ensure that every police action would be monitored and assessed fairly. These measures were expected to prevent abuse of power and enhance transparency in law enforcement practices. Through these efforts, the community began to believe that their struggle would not only expose racial discrimination but also become a revolution that would change the way the legal system operates and protect the rights of all citizens. With political organizations introducing reform bills, the government also began to respond to these demands by implementing new legal measures. The government realized that only true reform and the implementation of decisive measures could restore the community's trust in the police and legal system. One notable measure was the establishment of independent oversight committees for police actions. These agencies would be responsible for investigating citizen complaints, monitoring the daily actions of police officers, and ensuring that law enforcement did not violate citizens' rights. This not only protects citizens but also holds the police accountable for their actions. These oversight committees would operate independently of government agencies, ensuring that all interventions and decisions were made with absolute objectivity and fairness. Additionally, restructuring police training procedures was also a key part of these reforms. Officers would undergo new training programs to deepen their understanding of their role in protecting human rights and ensuring justice for all. These training programs would include conflict resolution skills without using violence, how to interact with the community, and raising awareness about racial discrimination, helping officers avoid violent and discriminatory actions. Both the government and social organizations hoped that these measures would improve the police system, creating a more transparent and equitable law enforcement environment for all citizens. Reform measures began to be implemented in many major cities, resulting in a significant change in how police interact with the public, especially minority communities. Reforms in monitoring police actions and new training processes regarding racial discrimination started to show clear impacts. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, police departments began adopting changes in their work processes, from using body cameras to enhancing community meetings between police and local residents. These meetings provided opportunities for the police to present their work and for the public to voice their concerns and perspectives on police behavior. While these reforms could not fix all the issues immediately, they clearly brought about positive changes in the relationship between the police and the community, helping to build trust and mutual understanding. Minority communities, especially the Black community, felt they were no longer treated as mere subjects of control, but were empowered to participate in discussions about justice. This not only improved the treatment by the police, but also paved the way for a more just society, where every citizen could feel safe when interacting with law enforcement. However, not everyone agreed with these reforms. Some groups still opposed the measures, arguing that they were too stringent and weakened the police's ability to operate effectively. These groups, mostly conservative elements in society, believed that increased oversight and changes in training processes were an intrusion on the police's freedom to act. They argued that these reforms prevented officers from carrying out their duties efficiently, especially in dangerous situations. Critics claimed that requiring police officers to adhere to strict recording regulations or participate in community meetings only increased inefficiency in their work. Despite this, pressure from the community, along with strong support from human rights organizations and politicians, continued to push for these changes. The discontent of some groups could not diminish the momentum of the justice movement. Protests and advocacy campaigns continued to grow, and the government could no longer ignore the changes taking place. The community understood that changing the police system was not an attack on the police, but an effort to protect the rights of all citizens and ensure that everyone is treated equally and fairly. The pressure from the community and these reforms created a revolution in awareness and action in society, which, despite opposition, could not be extinguished. Authorities finally recognized the need for widespread reforms in the police force. After a series of scandals related to abuse of power and racial discrimination, the government faced unavoidable pressure from the public and human rights organizations. The community voiced demands for changes not only in how the police carry out their duties, but also in how the system monitoring their actions operate. Protests and media campaigns highlighted that reforms must be comprehensive, including improvements in work processes, police retraining, and the creation of a strict oversight mechanism. After a prolonged period of delay, the government acknowledged that change could no longer be postponed. These reforms were seen not just as necessary steps to halt abuse of power, but also as a means of protecting citizens' rights, particularly those from vulnerable communities. Human rights organizations, community groups, and politicians relentlessly demanded that these measures be implemented decisively, and eventually, they were heard. The government committed to a comprehensive overhaul of the police force, aiming to create a fairer legal system where all citizens could trust the fairness in the administration of justice. With consensus from authorities, a new oversight regime was established to monitor police conduct throughout their service. The monitoring systems were designed to ensure that the police could not abuse their power without being detected and held accountable. One important measure in the new oversight system is the use of recording technology, including body cameras and cameras in patrol vehicles. These devices not only record the actions of the police, but also create a mechanism for the public to track and monitor their behavior. When officers carry out their duties, all their actions are recorded and can be reviewed if necessary. Independent oversight bodies, including human rights organizations, play a crucial role in ensuring that the police are held accountable for their actions. These organizations will receive complaints from citizens and investigate misconduct, ensuring that human rights violations are never overlooked. This is a significant step toward ensuring transparency in law enforcement, while also restoring public trust in the police force. The community can now feel more reassured knowing that the actions of police officers will always be carefully monitored and scrutinized. The collaboration between authorities, the police, and human rights organizations has become a crucial factor in building a fairer society where the rights of every citizen are equally protected. Under pressure from the community and human rights organizations, the government and legal bodies have recognized the necessity of cooperating to implement comprehensive reforms within the police system. Human rights organizations and civil society groups have continuously pushed for the restructuring and oversight of police activities to prevent abuse of power and racial discrimination. This cooperation extends beyond mere information exchange and has paved the way for state agencies agencies to actively participate in the reform process. Social organizations and politicians have acted as bridges, bringing together authorities, the police, and the community to discuss and plan reforms. They have begun developing collaborative programs to create a more transparent justice environment where citizens can trust law enforcement agencies. From organizing workshops and community meetings to strengthening oversight and reporting on police conduct, these agencies have worked together to find the most effective solutions for protecting justice and the rights of all citizens, particularly vulnerable communities. Along with this collaboration, one of the significant changes that police officers have started to realize is the importance of acting fairly and without discrimination in all situations. Police officers understand that, rather than simply enforcing the law in the old ways, they need to learn how to serve all communities fairly, without racial bias. During the reform process, training programs have been established to help police officers gain a deeper understanding of their role and responsibility in protecting human rights. These courses not only provide knowledge of the law but also help officers understand the psychology and needs of the communities they serve. This includes learning how to communicate with vulnerable communities, understanding cultural diversity, and maintaining professionalism in all situations. Police officers are no longer just taught how to use force, but how to use communication skills and peacefully resolve conflicts effectively. Officers have also come to realize that their actions not only affect individuals but also have broader social implications. Instead of seeing their work as merely a task, they now view protecting and serving the community as a significant responsibility that requires fairness, respect, and mutual understanding. These changes are gradually creating a police force that is not only strong in maintaining order but also compassionate and just in every action they take. After the successful reforms, the story of Joseph Taylor continues to serve as a lesson in justice, power, and resilience. Although the incident happened some time ago, the changes it brought about still deeply impact the community and the legal system. Reforms in the police force, particularly regarding the oversight of police actions and the restructuring of training procedures, have become an essential part of building a more just society. However, Taylor's story is not just about reform in the police sector. It also symbolizes resilience and determination. Despite being elderly and frail, he was not just a victim of racism, but became a person who changed the course of events. With one simple phone call, he not only protected his rights, but also helped change the way the police system treats vulnerable communities. His story serves as a reminder of the power of the individual when standing up against injustice and acting with resilience and fairness. The reflection in the community about Taylor's story has caused people to reconsider how they treat others, especially those in disadvantaged groups. The community no longer views racism and abuse of power as minor issues but recognizes them as systemic problems that need change. Minority groups, who were often overlooked and mistreated, are now starting to receive the attention and protection they rightfully deserve. Taylor's story expanded people's understanding of the suffering these communities have endured over time, making it impossible for society to continue living in indifference or ignorance. Inspired by Taylor's actions, social organizations and human rights groups have driven movements and campaigns to raise awareness about racism, not only in the police force but also in other areas of society like education, healthcare, and employment. Public dialogues and discussions in schools, workplaces, and communities have started to engage people from all walks of life. The public has begun to realize that racism is not just an issue of individuals but a part of the system, and to bring about change, there must be a comprehensive shift from every member of society. Taylor's story, with its wisdom and resilience, has created a powerful movement, bringing the issue of racism to the center of social dialogue. The younger generation, especially those who were once less concerned with justice and human rights issues, has now joined this struggle, hoping to create a fairer world for everyone. The story of Joseph Taylor not only changed how society views justice and power, but also became an inspiration for a new generation who will continue this struggle in the future. The younger generation, deeply inspired by his fight, has begun to realize that fairness and justice are not values to be taken lightly. They understand that this battle is not just for one individual, but for all those who have been oppressed, for all those whose rights have been taken away in society. Every generation faces its own challenges, but Taylor's story story helped the younger generation realize that they cannot stand aside. They have a responsibility to participate and change the world around them. This generation, with their understanding of social media and technology, has applied these tools to reach others in the community, raise awareness, and push for change. Calls for justice are not just heard in protests, but also in conversations between friends, in classrooms, and on social media platforms. This generation no longer waits for change from those before them, but actively stands up to continue the fight for a more equal society, where justice truly belongs to everyone, regardless of skin color, religion, or social status. Taylor's story is a prime example of how every individual can create monumental change, and these young people, inspired by his actions, will carry on and build a world where all citizens are treated fairly and equally. Joseph Taylor's story serves as a reminder of the power every individual holds, even if they may not possess the vast power of leaders or influential figures in society. But true power does not only lie in the hands of those at the top, it is also within the hands of every citizen when they stand up and fight for justice. My story is a reminder that power isn't always obvious, but anyone can change the course of things as long as they are resilient and don't give up. Taylor shared in an interview, after his story gained widespread attention, these words not only reflect his humility, but also serve as a powerful message to everyone, especially the younger generation, that change does not always come from positions of great power, but can arise from actions filled with determination and persistence. Every action, no matter how small, if taken at the right moment and in the right way, can create tremendous change, and an ordinary person like Taylor can spark a wave of change in society. Taylor's story also makes it clear that justice is not something that can only be achieved through violent struggles or grand revolutions, but can come from small, determined steps. These battles are not only fought on battlefields, but also in daily life, in the choices each individual makes, and in how they respond to the situations they face. Joseph Taylor's story is not just a lesson in justice, but also a lesson in the power of resilience and unyielding opposition to injustice. Those who pursue justice don't need to have great power. They just need to be willing to stand up, fight, and protect the values they believe in. In today's world, where racism and abuse of power still exist, Taylor's story will always be a strong source of motivation for those fighting for justice, no matter who they are, where they come from, or whether they possess any obvious power. The story of Joseph Taylor not only changed how society views justice and power, but also became a source of inspiration for a new generation, one that will continue this fight in the future. The younger generation, deeply inspired by his struggle, has begun to realize that fairness and justice are not values to be taken lightly. They understand that this fight is not just for one individual, but for all those who have been oppressed, for all those whose rights have been stripped away in society. Every generation faces its own challenges, but Taylor's story helped the younger generation realize that they cannot remain on the sidelines. They have a responsibility to participate and change the world around them. This generation, with their knowledge of social media and technology, has applied these tools to reach others in the community, raise awareness, and push for change. Calls for justice are no longer just heard in protests, but also in conversations between friends, in classrooms, and on social media platforms. This generation no longer waits for change from those before them, but actively stands up to continue the fight for a more equal society, where justice truly belongs to everyone, regardless of race, religion, or social status. Taylor's story is a prime example of how every individual can make a monumental change, and these young people, inspired by his actions, will carry on and build a world where all citizens are treated fairly and equally. Joseph Taylor's story serves as a reminder of the power every individual holds, even if they may not possess the vast power of leaders or influential figures in society. But true power does not only lie in the hands of those at the top, it is also within the hands of every citizen when they stand up and fight for justice. My story is a reminder that power isn't always obvious, but anyone can change the course of things, as long as they are resilient and don't give up. Taylor shared in an interview after his story gained widespread attention. These words not only reflect his humility, but also serve as a powerful message to everyone, especially the younger generation, that change does not always come from positions of great power, but can arise from actions filled with determination and persistence. Every action, no matter how small, if taken at the right moment and in the right way, can create tremendous change, and an ordinary person like Taylor can spark a wave of change in society. Taylor's story also makes it clear that justice is not something that can only be achieved through violent struggles or grand revolutions, but can come from small, determined steps. These battles are not only fought on battlefields, but also in daily life, in the choices each individual makes, and in how they respond to the situations they face. Joseph Taylor's story is not just a lesson in justice, but also a lesson in the power of resilience and unyielding opposition to injustice. Those who pursue justice don't need to have great power, they just need to be willing to stand up, fight, and protect the values they believe in. In today's world, where racism and abuse of power still exist, Taylor's story will always be a strong source of motivation for those fighting for justice, no matter who they are, where they come from, or whether they possess any obvious power. Taylor's story will not only be a memory of the past, but also a vital part of the ongoing struggle for justice. And, as the younger generations follow in Joseph Taylor's footsteps, they will not forget that it is the resilience, the refusal to give up, and the courage to demand justice that will be the key to creating change, not only for themselves, but for society as a whole. His story is a reminder of the power of individuals to shape society, showing that one person's action can create a ripple effect that leads to a better world. The lesson of Joseph Taylor is not just about the fight for one individual's justice, but about the fight for all those who have no voice. The reforms within law enforcement, along with the changing societal awareness, have not only changed the way the police force carries out their duties, but also shifted how society perceives human rights. From this, human rights organizations, social groups, and politicians began collaborating to implement legal measures and wide-reaching reforms. New training programs were introduced, monitoring mechanisms established to ensure the police do not abuse their power, and, most importantly, every action taken by law enforcement now falls under the scrutiny of the public and independent bodies. These reforms have not only transformed law enforcement, but also helped protect the rights of citizens, especially those in vulnerable communities.